In the autumn of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood on the edge of collapse. The Crusader states, carved out less than a century earlier, were surrounded by powerful Islamic realms united under a single, determined leader, Salahuddin, known as the West as Saladin. At this moment of danger, the fate of the kingdom rested on the shoulders of a boy who should by all accounts have been far too frail to rule. Baldwin IV was just 16 years old, recently crowned king, and already known across Christendom as the Leper King. Baldwin's illness was no secret. The disease robbed him of sensation in his hands and feet, slowly weakening his body even as he grew into adolescence. Many doubted that he would live long enough to secure an heir, let alone defend his realm. Yet Baldwin was no passive figurehead. Trained in the arts of kingship and war, he possessed an iron will that belied his deteriorating health. He could no longer wield a sword with the ease of his peers, but he could inspire command and, most importantly, stood as a living symbol of defiance. The story of the Battle of Montgisard is inseparable from Baldwin's condition. His frailty, which might have doomed his cause, became the very thing that gave his leadership moral weight. To the Crusaders, their king's struggle against disease mirrored their own struggle against overwhelming odds. And it was this unlikely young ruler, riding with the relic of the true cross, who would face Salahuddin's mighty invasion in one of the most dramatic clashes of the Crusades. When Salahuddin launched his invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177, he did so with confidence and ambition. As Sultan of both Egypt and Syria, he commanded resources far greater than the fractured Crusader states. His goal was to strike deep into Palestine, plunder its lands, and ultimately threaten Jerusalem itself. To achieve this, Salahuddin gathered a host that contemporary sources placed between 20,000 and 30,000 men, a formidable blend of cavalry, infantry, and support units. It was the largest Muslim army the kingdom had faced in years, and it seemed poised to overwhelm any resistance. Opposing him was Baldwin IV, who would muster only a fraction of that number. The young king rallied around 375 knights, bolstered by a few thousand infantry, and drew support from the Knights Templar, who had managed to regroup after an early setback at Gaza. This was not the grand muster of the Crusade nobility. Many lords were absent on campaigns elsewhere, and the suddenness of Salahuddin's invasion left Baldwin scrambling to gather what forces he could. By any measure, his army was desperately outnumbered. Salahuddin's advance into the Kingdom of Jerusalem was bold but fatally flawed. His army had crossed from Egypt in late autumn, a season when supplies were already stretched thin. To sustain such a vast host, Salahuddin's men relied heavily on raiding the countryside, stripping villages of food, seizing livestock, and burdening themselves with plunder. What began as a strategic move to weaken the Crusaders also had a dangerous side effect. It pulled his forces apart. Rather than keeping his army in tight formation, detachments spread across southern Palestine in search of provisions, loot, and prisoners. This dispersal was not just a matter of logistics, it was fueled by confidence. Salahuddin believed Baldwin posed no serious threat. The Leper King, barely able to ride unaided, seemed an unlikely commander, and most of the Crusader knights were thought to be tied down defending remote castles. In Salahuddin's view, the road to Jerusalem was open. As his troops raided and plundered, he allowed discipline to slip, convinced the enemy could not muster an effective counterattack. As Baldwin's small force prepared to confront Salahuddin, the young king knew that morale would determine the outcome. His men were exhausted from the rapid march, and they faced an enemy many times their size. To falter in spirit was to be defeated before a sword was even drawn. Baldwin therefore turned to the most powerful symbol in Christendom, the true cross, the sacred relic believed to be a fragment of the cross on which Christ was crucified. In full view of his knights and infantry, Baldwin was lifted from his litter, his body weakened by disease, and placed on horseback. Then, in a moment that would be remembered for generations, he knelt before the relic of the cross. His frail frame and bandaged hands were unmistakable, yet his voice rang with determination as he called on his men to trust in God's providence. Here was a king who could barely hold a weapon, yet he stood ready to ride at the front of the charge. To Crusader soldiers, this act was more than a ceremony. It was proof that divine favor was with them. Baldwin's illness, far from being a weakness, became a sign of miraculous resolve. If their leper king could summon the strength to fight, then so too could they. Morale surged and the army's resolve hardened. As the knights formed their wedge and the infantry readied behind them, they carried not just steel and banners into battle, but the conviction that they were the chosen instruments of God's will. The battle did not begin with two armies squaring off in neat lines. Instead, it unfolded as a sudden and violent collision, the product of Baldwin's speed and Salahuddin's unpreparedness. On November 25, 1177, near the village of Montgisard, close to Ramia, Baldwin's compact force crested the terrain and bore down on Salahuddin's host before the Sultan could bring his scattered troops together. Salahuddin, realizing the danger, attempted to buy time by deploying his elite Mamluk guard to form a defensive screen while messengers rode to recall the raiding detachments. But the ground there worked against him. The terrain narrowed, limiting the mobility of his cavalry and compressing his formations. Before his men could settle into defensive order, the Crusader wedge of heavy knights slammed forward. The shock was devastating. Baldwin's cavalry struck with precision, driving straight through Salahuddin's vanguard. Horses and men crashed under the momentum, and confusion spread rapidly throughout the ranks. Units not yet in formation wavered, then broke. The weight of the charge, combined with the raised banners of the True Cross, carried a psychological force that outmatched numbers. To the Muslim soldiers, the sudden eruption of disciplined knights seemed almost supernatural, an army too small to threaten them, now cutting straight through their lines. Salahuddin rode among his men, urging them to stand, but the collapse moved faster than he could respond. Sections of his army fell back in disarray, and gaps widened until his once mighty host dissolved into fragments. For the first time, Salahuddin faced not just resistance, but the very real threat of annihilation. Once the vanguard shattered, the collapse spread like wildfire. The Crusader wedge had not only pierced his lines, it had pierced the morale of his men. Soldiers already exhausted from the long march and burdened with loot abandoned their spoils in panic. The narrow ground, which had hampered his cavalry, now worked to the Crusaders' advantage. There was little room to reorganize, and retreating units crashed into those attempting to fight. What began as a breakdown of the front became a rout across the field. Salahuddin's bodyguard, the elite corps of his army, fought fiercely to protect him. Surrounded by confusion, they formed a desperate shield wall as he attempted to withdraw. Historians wrote that the Sultan himself narrowly escaped capture, forced to ride hard from the battlefield with only a fragment of his once mighty force. Thousands of his men were cut down in their pursuit, their flight turned into slaughter by Crusaders, pressing their advantage without mercy.